Some of you know that this Sunday I'm beginning a series of talks about the 5 basic unity principles. Each time that I speak in June and into July, I will speak about 1 or 2 of these 5 principles. We'll also focus on them during the second hour, during the spiritual food group discussion. Although today during that time we're wrapping up our discussion about prosperity principles. So beginning next week, we'll start discussing what I talk about in the earlier hour. But it's rather confusing. The schedule is just confusing. It's interrupted by potlucks and other celebrations, and when Chad speaks, he won't necessarily speak directly about the principles, but they show up in our talks all the time. So I've printed a schedule for you. It's on the back of the handout you received this morning, and hopefully you'll be able to figure it out. It took me a while to even figure out how to make sure I had it right, and I'm not sure I do. So, the 5 unity principles, I want to credit Reverend Ellen Debenport for some of the ideas in this talk. She gave a great introduction of the 5 principles in a book that she wrote. And I don't have it here in the bookstore, but I am going to Unity Village this week to celebrate my colleagues' graduation, those who were in the year behind me. So maybe I'll bring some of those books back for you if you're interested in reading Ellen's book. It's valuable. I'll be back next Sunday and on time for the Woman's Song concert. So Ellen gives a definition of principle, which is as simple as you can make it. A principle is a law that never changes. A law that never changes. And it applies to all people, everywhere, all the time. A law that never changes, that applies to everybody, all the time, no matter who they are, with no respecter of persons. We learned principles as children. 2 + 2 = 4, all the time, in whatever language, in whatever counters you use, whether they be pebbles or numbers on a paper. If you don't get 4, it's not because the principle was wrong, it's because you calculated it wrong. That's what mathematical principles are, correct? So, and we learned that especially when we got frustrated at the higher levels, algebra, trigonometry. Like, ooh, why didn't I get this right? It wasn't the principle's fault. It was yours. Or misunderstanding, not fault, I guess. But spiritual principles are the same way. They work the same way all the time for everybody. And we can learn to use them to our advantage, like getting into the higher levels of math. If you really get math, you can use it for such valuable things. You can use those principles to do amazing things and calculate things. But if you don't understand them, you can get really frustrated and keep getting the wrong answers. That's what spiritual principles are like, too. Answers that don't work for us. They might not be wrong, but they're not the greatest. So, suppose, like, for example, the law of gravity. Suppose you didn't understand it. Suppose you just had questions like, why do my feet stay on the ground? Why does something drop when I release it? Why doesn't it just float in the air? Why when I try to move, and the faster I move, the more tired I get? Why, when I step off a cliff, why do I fall? Well, yeah, we giggle. I mean, of course, we know why, because of gravity. It's obvious. Even if we don't know how it works, we know it's there. And it works all the time, without fail, for everybody. That's a law of our physical universe. Well, it's the same with spiritual laws. Just like gravity, always working all the time, dependable. And the thing is, it really doesn't restrict us. Gravity doesn't restrict us. We can use it, knowing that it's so dependable, we can use it to build on. We can build skyscrapers because of gravity. And we can do amazing engineering with airplanes and rocket ships because we understand the law of gravity. The same thing with electricity. It's a universal phenomenon, a law. Electricity is there. Whether we know it or not, it's in our air. And as scientists started playing with it, they learned more about it. And the more they learned, the more they were able to use it. But only once they understood the parameters of it. And once we were able to harness this invisible, all-present thing called electricity, we were able to just shoot forward in technology to the point now where everything's wireless. Can you imagine what they would have thought 100 years ago? So knowing electricity and its principles helps us to harness it and use it to our advantage. The same goes with spiritual laws. Invisible, but everywhere present. And if we don't know about them, we walk in the dark, so to speak, about them. But if we learn about them, we can use their parameters to make our lives easier, more productive in whatever that means to us, more filled with joy. So we'll be talking about these spiritual principles that Unity has discussed and condensed into 5. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about how that even got started. Unity was founded in 1889, let's say 1890, by Myrtle and Charles Fillmore in Kansas City, Missouri. And because the Fillmore's perspective is from the Christian culture in America, their teachings of the universal principles have Christian languaging. They use the Bible as the primary reference and Jesus' teachings as the master teacher. But the Fillmores, who began using metaphysics for their own physical healing, had explored and read and studied and gathered ideas from all over the world, from Eastern culture as well. And so they started to see that principles of the universe articulated in every culture, just different languaging and different contexts. And they shared these principles from their own healing as well as from their prayer life. They shared it in their publications, their teachings, and their classes, and their prayer. And they use the words of Jesus as a basis for that. And that's why we talk mostly about Jesus, but we also talk about the Buddhist teachings and Muhammad's teachings and other great masters, because the principles that they teach are universal truths. So a century after the Fillmores started the Unity movement, their great-granddaughter, Connie Fillmore Bazzi, who had gone to Unity Institute to become a minister at the same time that Rev Chad went to Unity Institute in the 70s. He knows her personally. So Connie, the great-granddaughter of Myrtle and Charles, was then the Unity School of Christianity's president. And she was asked to write an article about what Unity teaches in the Little Daily Word magazine. And she wrote an article that just was so helpful to so many. It soon became a little publication, a separate booklet called The Keys to the Kingdom, 5 Fundamentals of Truth. And it's become that was meant to be a month-long study of the teachings of unity. And now the 5 principles that Connie assimilated and synthesized from all the teachings of unity founders, those 5 principles have become a foundation for teaching in many unity centers. So Connie took all of the stuff she was studying from the classic unity literature and condensed it into 5 points. There are a lot more principles that can be explored, of course. 5 would be too simplistic, but she wrote this. She said, "My basis for the way that I framed it was what I had studied in ministerial school." She said, "I wanted to make them easy to understand, not too wordy, not too highfalutin. Just make them so people who might not know anything at all about unity or metaphysics would be able to say, 'Oh, that makes sense.' That was my stab at it," she writes. So this little article caught on and has now become the subject of many talks and discussions and debates in unity centers. 2 decades after Connie wrote the article, I was preparing for ministerial school. And I memorized those 5 unity principles for my entrance exam. I suggest that you memorize them, Dan, as you're going on to ministerial school this fall, because you're inevitably going to be asked to write an essay about one of them or list them all. But, memorizing them, they didn't come alive. And in fact, I was every day in class, on the bulletin board was a poster listing the 5 unity principles. I could see it every day in class for the 3 years I was there. When they came alive was once I started ministry on a daily basis here. I heard myself saying one of them, mentioning one of them in every talk, in every class, in every counseling session. Although they weren't said, well, unity teaches this 5 principles, I heard myself citing that principle or that one as I spoke about the truth as I see it. And so I realized that it was also working in my daily life. I could remember when I felt like all the negativity was taking over, I could declare there is only one presence and power, and that is good. And that became a powerful statement for me when I feel that something negative is getting big. I could declare what I know as the truth. We'll look at each one of them in a minute. The Fillmores, or Charles especially, did a lot of writing. And he wrote, never saying the 5 unity principles, because it wasn't until 100 years later that somebody condensed them. And he didn't always call these universal laws the same thing. Sometimes he called them spiritual truths, sometimes unchangeable truths, sometimes divine principles, sometimes immutable laws. So it's real hard to read through the old unity literature from Fillmore or Emily Cady or anyone else and get a list of what the laws are. It's just like, that's real. I couldn't find them myself, and I'm very happy that Connie boiled it down to 5 with a lot of room for discussion. But what Charles did say that caught my eye is how these truths are everywhere in everything. And he wanted to make sure that we didn't identify ourselves as a new religion, because religion has, you got to believe this, and you got to let go of this, and you got to believe this, and believe this, and believe this. What he said is, these are laws that are self-evident. All we need to do is awaken to them, regardless of the cultural religion that we are in. He said, so long as religion assumes that the spirit creates and sustains man, and the universe can be cajoled, and by prayer or some other appeal it can be induced to change its laws, religion, cannot hope to be recognized by those who know that unchangeable law rules everywhere and in everything. Religion, he said, seems to think that we can get the law to change for our interests. What he wanted us to get clearly into our consciousness is that these laws are there, and if we learn about them, we can use them for our good. We can cooperate with them. Just like if we know about gravity and electricity, we can use them and cooperate with them for our good, for our best power. And Charles said, and of course he wrote a long time ago, so he said the word man, meaning man and woman, but this is what he said. No man lives a moment without them, and few men recognize them. No woman lives a moment without them, and few women recognize them. So our task is to become aware of these laws and see how they can be, as we get to know them, worked with, played with, and used for our most joyful possible living. So I hope you'll decide to attend our services for the next few weeks so you can allow your consciousness to open up to the powerful implications of these principles and the teachings that they give us in our practical lives. They are the sum of the universal laws, and they're worthy of our conscious application. Before we close, I want to look at each one of these one by one. I had them on the PowerPoint, but so be it. You have them on the yellow paper that you were handed. And if you don't have one, if you can read on with a friend or just listen. Or I'm going to say them one by one and ask you to say them aloud after I say them. And I'll lead you in the reading of them. And after we read them, be comfortable with a few moments of silence to let that statement sink in. If you want to read, do you have a paper? All right. The first one speaks of God, what God is. We're reading from the farthest left column. There's lots of paraphrases. I just chose this one. It felt good to me. There is only one ultimate power in the universe. That power is God, and its nature is absolute, unchanging good. Together, there is only one ultimate power in the universe. That power is God, and its nature is absolute, unchanging good. The second one talks about what is humanity, okay? There's a lot to say about that first statement. There's a lot to say about the second statement. We'll talk about these next week. The second one says, what is a human being? And think about it if you grew up in a different culture within Christianity, how this is different from the catechism you might have been taught. I'll read it first. Human beings were created from absolute good, so our inherent nature is also good. We call the inherent goodness of the human beings the Christ. Together, human beings were created from absolute good, and so our inherent nature is also good. We call the inherent goodness of human beings the Christ. The third principle talks about our thoughts. Our thoughts. And think about how Chad often points out this little snake here. This little snake is here to remind us to watch our thoughts like we would watch a rattlesnake. Our thoughts are our creative power. Whatever we persistently focus our thoughts and feelings upon manifests in our lives. Read it with me. Our thoughts are our creative power. Whatever we persistently focus on our thoughts and feelings upon manifests in our lives. The fourth one focuses on prayer and meditation. It's foundational in the Unity movement. And it is our way of remembering who we truly are. This is what it says. Prayer and meditation are essential elements of the spiritual life because they focus our thoughts on our oneness with God and all of creation. Together. Prayer and meditation are essential elements of the spiritual life because they focus our thoughts on our oneness with God and all of creation. And the fifth one is where, and it reminds me of why we call Unity practical Christianity, because we need to practice, and it is practical. Here's what it says. It is not enough to know the truth, but we must put that truth into action in our lives. We must live the truth we know. Say it with me. It is not enough to know the truth. We must put that truth into action in our lives. We must live the truth we know. I invite you over this next week, as you prepare to come and listen to my talk about points 1 and 2 next week, I invite you to reread points 1 and 2 in a moment of calm when you can let it sink in. If you give it time, questions will arise. Especially that word good, God, the good. What does that mean? Let those questions arise. Let them float around in your awareness as you go to work and the store and your meetings this week. Just let them happen. You might even read them right before you fall asleep and see what your dreams tell you. Questions will float up. Bring them to the service next week and see if I address them. And if I don't, there'll be lots of time in the next hour to talk about them, points 1 and 2. And we are excited that you invited me to speak of the 5 Unity principles. Since last July when I came here and I had those informal pat chats that many of you came to, so many questions were, tell us about the Unity basic principles. So I'm excited to use this time to share them with you in a meditative way. Watch how they show up in our lives as we explore them. So we know that, as I said before, if you know how gravity works, you can work with it for your advantage. If you know how electricity works and you get it, you might not get stung and you might get empowered. It's the same with universal principles. If we know what they are, we can work with them, and we can play with them, and we can rejoice in them. Thank you. Namaste.